Southern Indiana in 1982. A new stop for me as my family moved around a lot, having a parent in the military. I always liked Indiana. I'd hoped that maybe after high school I'd go to Indiana U, and then, who knows? But life has a way of twisting and turning and taking you down a road you never knew was there. I wouldn't be here for long, but I carried my secret with me for the next few decades before I dared share it with anyone. I always knew it was a Bigfoot. It was just so damn scary to accept the fact that what I was seeing was real. Was I seeing things? Hallucinating? Aside from myself, Oscar saw it too. And he's what keeps me grounded, but all these years later, I still can't shake that feeling even though it's been so long since it happened. I can promise you, I will never forget it. That was the summer of '82, and I had the biggest crush on a girl we'll just call Annie. She lived outside of my neighborhood, and since I'd recently gotten my license, I thought I'd cruise around her house, just to catch a glimpse of her outside. I thought maybe I could work up the nerve to stop and talk to her, eventually. It sounded pretty smooth in my head until the brakes on my fixer-upper Mustang II failed and it was back to two-legged transportation, at least for a little while. Now I didn't have a car in suburbia. New plan. Take my lab Oscar for a very long walk, about 3 miles each way, or I could take a shortcut through a swampy, woody area. It would cut the time in half, and what's more innocent than taking your dog for a walk, right? Everybody loves dogs, and Oscar was irresistible. The first time I went through these woods, I got the unmistakable feeling I was being watched. Even Oscar, my lab, seemed a little different. Sometimes he would just abruptly stop and look in a particular direction and then growl. Other times, he'd just put his tail between his legs, whine a little, and try to lead me out of there as fast as he could muster. I know that a dog's senses are off the hook compared to a human's. Their sense of smell alone is ridiculously higher than people. And I learned that whatever Oscar became aware of, I'd make sure to try and pay attention. But I honestly thought it was just a deer. Oscar was a good-sized dog, about 85 pounds and very protective of me. On one trip, we both got a whiff of something that smelled just horrible one day. The smell seemed to confuse Oscar's sense of direction, but not me. Mostly oblivious, I did lead the way out, pulling Oscar behind me. Each time we made the trek, and we got to a certain bend from our newly made trail, that creepy feeling would happen. It was kind of a high spot on the trail, just several feet higher, but it overlooked the trail of where we had come in. I know that most teenagers, but especially guys, seem to have that feeling of indestructibility, like nothing could ever happen to them. More like stupidity. Anyhow, those walks paid off as I did manage to get up the nerve and speak to her. As Oscar and I walked down the street by her house, she called out my name. My heart was aflutter. She recognized me. Well, of course she did. We went to the same school. All those times in the cafeteria, at basketball games, or passing each other in the hallways, heading to class, she knew me. This was a step beyond. I remember feeling a little awkward and goofy, stumbling over words and saying very few when I did. I was so nervous. Being an only child can have its drawbacks. The art of conversation was not my forte, especially at 16, but I was certainly willing to try. She and her girlfriends kind of made a circle around me and Oscar, laughing and giggling, chatting and playing with the dog. I was definitely out of my element and seriously lacking personality, but I gave myself an A for effort. Annie was a knockout and didn't have a boyfriend. What was wrong with her? Farrah Fawcett and Lonnie Anderson had nothing over this beautiful brunette. I think I preferred brunettes now. She didn't seem to question why I was in her neighborhood. The plan had worked, and Oscar was helping as only he could, wagging his tail and running about. All the girls loved him. The walk back at 3:05 p.m. on July 16, 1982, was a day I will never forget on so many levels. My mind was somewhere else as we entered those woods. The only thing that snapped me back to reality was the forceful tug on Oscar's leash. He stopped dead in his tracks and wasn't moving. What sounded like a large rock bouncing off a hardwood tree relatively close startled me, and then behind me, something else moved quickly around bushes and trees, deliberately skirting around us. I observed 3 white-tailed deer scattering. Their white tails seemed to almost float in unison. Someone was making noise. It sounded like talking, or maybe the better way to describe it might be chattering. And the voice bellowed. I don't know why, but an awareness overcame me that I was not supposed to be walking in these woods, and that I needed to leave. But it wasn't going to be that easy. Oscar and I were close to the halfway mark, and Oscar wasn't budging all of a sudden. Humph! Being on the lower path of the trail, something told me to look up. There, on that elevated mound of dirt, maybe 10 or so feet above us, and another 50 feet further away, was this hulk of a man, and he was perched atop the mound. The figure was dark, as the shadows from the trees kind of played off what I could only see was a very wide and broad figure. Playing basketball in school, I was surrounded by taller players, but not only was he taller than most of my opponents, but ridiculously wider and thicker. I've always compared it to a football player, as the shoulders that were so broad that they could kind of merge into the trapezius muscles and connect straight to the head. At 16, long and gawky, this was easily 2 to 3 times my width and several inches taller. Its arms looked bigger than my legs. It must have weighed 400 or 500 pounds. It was hard to gauge from its perch on the hill, but if I had to guess, I'd say it was close to 7 feet tall. My impression of the expression on its face seemed to say, "Get out of my home." I was momentarily paralyzed, staring and in complete and utter shock. I couldn't take my eyes off of it, no matter how hard I tried. I could now see more facial features, the brow, which seemed very ape-like, and yet there was still a human-like quality in its expression. It must have been a he, as its wrinkled and weather-beaten face reminded me of an elder man. I remember suddenly feeling lightheaded, and my ears started to ring. My mouth just hanging open, my eyes were wide. The grin on its face changed, and the mouth curled and bared large and what looked like jagged yellow teeth. I started to snap back to reality, as I could now hear Oscar whining and hugging the ground. Somehow, I knew not to proceed further, but to go back the way I came, slowly. I only turned for a second as I grabbed Oscar by the collar and forcefully moved him in our new direction. Breaking the silence was the sound of a siren. It was off in the distance, but I turned my head for just a split second, only to look back up at the mound, and he was gone. I'm not sure if this makes any sense, but I could still feel his presence. He hadn't left after all. I heard something, like a thick branch, pop and snap. It was so loud at first, I thought it was a gunshot. Oscar kind of snapped out of his funk and now seemed ready to do an about-face, and quite frankly, so did I. He was still out there, bushes and tall weeds suddenly shook, but I couldn't see him. He was following us out as we continued to hear noises. Limbs popped, trees snapped, and bushes continued to shake along our way off to our left side. It was unnerving, to say the least. I don't know who was more petrified, me or my dog. I wondered if Oscar had seen it way before I did, and I was just oblivious. If only he could tell me. On that day, once we were escorted out by that creature, a very long walk turned into a quick run as Oscar and I made it home in no time flat. I don't think dogs have nightmares of Bigfoot, but I remember waking up some nights in a cold sweat. My nightmares seemed to consist of it following me home and crouching behind a bush. Sometimes it was the corner of the house. My heart would start racing, and then I'd wake up, confused and scared. I never walked through those woods again, mostly based on my fear of that thing, that Bigfoot. It's always in the back of my head. Years later, I still think about it. I never told anyone, especially Annie. I didn't want anyone to think I was crazy. We dated our junior year, but mutually broke up as my family moved out to the West Coast. Washington State, of all places, where the subject of Bigfoot isn't scoffed at. All these years later, I've reconnected with her on social media. She's married with 2 girls, and I'm also married and still living in Washington. We talked about friends, family, and acquaintances, jobs, and such. I don't know why I felt the need to share my encounter, but I did about that day. She's the only person I've ever told that wasn't more or less a complete stranger, and she laughed at me. Annie's comment was, "You've always had such a great sense of humor." Yeah, I laughed it off. This wasn't what I expected, but what's that saying? You can never go home again? Places change, and so do people. They're never the same. This is my opinion. You may feel differently, Mike, but to me, it doesn't matter who has a sighting, when or where in the world. If you've had an encounter, be careful who you tell. You could lose your credibility. So protect what you've built up and earned your whole life. As far as I know, Bigfoot's still a mystery, and although I'm sharing my story with you, anonymity is still necessary because Bigfoot isn't always socially acceptable. Thanks for letting me on the soapbox and letting me tell my story. Sincerely, J.H. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this encounter story, please like and share so we can get Bigfoot's Wilderness some additional exposure. Things are on the horizon. This website that I've been working on is up, but needs some more TLC. But it also has a shop, so please check it out. There's an upcoming raffle for a mug, and of course there's my blog, all on the website. If you like, you can follow me on Instagram at Bigfoot's Wilderness, or Facebook at the same name, Bigfoot's Wilderness. And I'm also on Pinterest, again, at the same name. Twitter is the only one that's different, and that one's called Bigfoot's Wilder 1, the number 1. So remember to check out bigfootswilderness.com. And by the way, the video in this encounter story was from a recent hike to Medoc Mountain State Park in North Carolina. There wasn't a soul out there but me. I believe I'm on the Discovery Trail, and while out there taking pictures, I had something occur. But I'll save that for another time. Have a great night.